Our speaker tonight, Professor Dermot Groome, is one of the most distinguished members of what might be called the International Humanitarian Law Bar. Can I call it that? Okay. Courts that try war criminals are a relatively rare phenomenon, or certainly a new phenomenon, or relatively new in the last 30 years. After Nuremberg and Tokyo, just after World War II, there were no international courts of that kind until 1994, when the UN set up the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Professor Groome, who got his law degree at Boston College and was a prosecutor before the ICTY, as it is known in shorthand. He wasn't just any prosecutor. He was the chief prosecutor for 8 of the major cases, including Slobodan Milosevic, the former Serbian leader and the mastermind of the decade of wars that broke up the country once known as Yugoslavia. And he prosecuted Ratko Mladic, the Serb general who carried out the mass atrocities in Bosnia. You have to be a patient person to go into this field. And that's an understatement. General Mladic, for example, was indicted in July of 1995. He was caught. He was arrested in 2011. The trial went on for 4.5 years. Dermot Groome was the chief prosecutor for the first 2.5 years of the 4.5. Slobodan Milosevic was a slightly quicker case. He was indicted in 1999 almost at the very end of the Balkan Wars, arrested in 2001, and then put on trial the following year. Prosecutor Groome prosecuted, as I say, the Mladic case for 2.5 years. And then after 2.5 years, he turned it over to a colleague. At the end of the day, in 2017, Mladic was found guilty of every charge except one. In short, if you were to wind up in the dock at an international tribunal, and God forbid this happens to anybody, you wouldn't want Dermot Groome to be the prosecutor. Tonight, he will discuss some of the big lessons he's learned at the Hague Tribunal and how they might apply in Ukraine. Unlike Slobodan Milosevic, who made it through the whole series of wars with hardly a scratch, Vladimir Putin was indicted just last month, in real time, even as the war crimes continued. It may take years for Putin to answer to the charges, if he ever does. But the question Professor Groome is going to address tonight is what else is there out there to ensure that justice is done, even to the president of Russia. So I'll give you Professor Dermot Groome.
Thank you. It's good to be here, and I recognize that there are many things you might have done on the nicest day of the year so far, other than come inside and talk about war crimes. But I do appreciate that. I want to thank the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs, and particularly Roy Goodman, for inviting me to come here today. Now, I just met Roy less than 2 hours ago, but I've known him much longer than that. And that's because some of his work became a big turning point in the investigation on Slobodan Milosevic. And we're now the 30-year anniversary of him winning the Pulitzer for the reporting that he did. And I think he deserves a round of applause for that. Now, I talk about his work a lot because it's very relevant when I talk about how we do these cases. So I'm going to give you a brief tour of how that reporting intersected and assisted and became a pivot point in the Milosevic investigation. This should be sound.
We're being deported in trains, and I had that very feeling. It was a state in operation. Railways are operated by states in Europe. Everything was organized from the very top. That meant it was Slobodan Milosevic himself who must have ordered people to organize this thing. Throughout, when I was seeing this train, that this was the tip of the iceberg, that this was the tip. This was definitely evidence of something, but there was an iceberg below, and I ought to try to explore it, but I didn't know how.
So we knew how, and we pursued this. And so Kozluk is the red circle in Bosnia. It's a small rural hamlet, a Muslim hamlet. And the Bosnian Serb army had already taken control of it. And all the members of that hamlet handed over their hunting rifles and said, look, we'll live under Serb rule. And they lived there peacefully for about 30 days or so. And then one day buses showed up and armed men showed up and said, well, we've changed our mind. We want you out of here. And they were all loaded onto buses. They were made to sign a document in which they donated their property and their farms to the Serb authorities on their way out. And then they took buses across the border into Serbia. And then around Ruma, I believe it was, they were put on a train. And the train then took them to the Hungarian border. So in that investigation, taking our starting point, Roy's work, this is a manifest of all the citizens in the village, typed up, signed. Very interesting to us, the official stamps, and wanted to know who were the people that organized this. One of them turned out to be a covert operative from the State Security Service of Serbia and was working under an alias here. When they got to the Hungarian border, they were sent across the Hungarian border, and the Hungarian authorities said, well, where are your passports? And of course, none of them had any passports. They were just very rural people, probably never traveled more than 20 miles from their homes, and they were sent back to Serbia. And in about 48 hours, they were issued Serbian passports. Bosnian citizens issued Serbian passports. And I asked the same questions that Roy asked. Who can pick up the phone and say, I want a train commandeered to take people across the country? I want, I think it was like 60, 70 people I want passports for non-Serb citizens so we can ethnically cleanse them over the border. So from this, we investigated. It led us to the Ministry of Interior, to a person by the name of Jovica Stanisic, who I prosecuted him, and then ultimately on to Milosevic. And we'll come back to how reporting and open source material can be really instrumental in the work of international prosecutors. Roy did a fantastic job of introducing me. Just a few more facts. I started my career in the Manhattan DA's office. That's been in the news a lot last week. I could see my old office window there. I spent 6 years in Jamaica, West Indies, and 3 years in Cambodia doing human rights work, 12 years at the Yugoslav Tribunal, and I've been 9 years at Penn State Dickinson Law. If my discussion today sparks your interest in learning more about how we do this work, PBS Frontline a couple of years ago did a documentary where they followed the Mladic case for 5 years. We gave them access to our meetings, to our witness preparation. So it's a real insider's look. And then the other document, I was a part of a group of experts that really study the International Criminal Court. And we made recommendations, like 190-something recommendations. So if your interest is in the International Criminal Court, you may find that interesting to you. So you don't need me here tonight to tell you about all of the horrible things that we're witnessing in Ukraine, okay? We've seen some of the worst atrocities happen now for over a year. What I want to talk about is, will we be able to bring everyone to justice? So I called my colleagues in the Ukraine Prosecutor General's office yesterday to say, could you give me the most up-to-date information? I was speaking about their work. So they're a very busy office. It's a relatively large office, and they have experienced prosecutors. But as of yesterday, they have 96,551 crimes related to the invasion. Okay? That would overwhelm DOJ if we put every prosecutor on it. Okay? They have 647 identified suspects. Many are not in custody yet. There have been nearly 500 children killed, and over 90,000 civilian buildings and structures have been destroyed. Okay? So with their best efforts, there's no way they will ever be able to bring the people that should be brought to justice. So how do we help them? So last May, the Biden administration, through an announcement by Secretary of State Blinken, announced the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group. And I was asked to be a member of that. So I've been to Ukraine and the region twice, and I'll go again in June. And essentially what the Biden administration is trying to do, they have some experienced prosecutors over there. They're not familiar with this law. Let's get them expertise that they need. And so I'm over there, or we're working with them, nearly daily through Zoom and on the phone and email. And then many of us are going over regularly. The project is now being staffed or managed by Ambassador Clint Williamson. And it's being administered by Georgetown Law and Anna Cave, who's the director of the National Security Center at Georgetown Law. And then just last month, the UK and the European Union have joined in that effort. So now we're all coordinating together and trying to give the prosecutor the support that they need. We're helping them develop a strategy for dealing with so many cases. We're advising them on specific cases that they're not familiar with. We have a military advisor that's helping them understand artillery impacts and how they gather evidence, that. And then we're also training them in international criminal law. So in addition to that, Penn State has also been working in this area. So I became concerned when Zelensky put out a call for volunteers from foreign countries to come. I was concerned that that might attract people that had no formal training and did not understand the obligations that a combatant has when they're engaging in armed conflict. So I created a training video for volunteers. It was then translated into Ukrainian, and that's been available for people going over there. At least they know the basics. They know about the principles of distinction and proportionality. Okay? I've also developed a series of training videos for prosecutors and working with ACA, the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group, to scale that up. Last fall, when I was teaching international criminal law at Penn State, we enrolled several senior Ukrainian prosecutors, and there they were in Zoom attending my class. And it was actually really good for my students to see some of these people. The air siren went off and they grabbed their computer and they ran down to the bomb shelter, and they were paying attention. They weren't going to miss anything. So that's how we're trying to support them, but that's still, they're not going to be able to do it. So what about the ICC? Is that going to be able to close the remaining impunity gap? So let's spend a few minutes on this. There was very broad support for the ICC's initiation of investigation. Over 40 countries made referrals to the ICC, and some states are sending staff and some are sending additional funding. Now, of course, this raises some questions about the political independence of the ICC. It's chronically underfunded. It struggles to do all the other investigations. It's supposed to be completely independent, but in the case of Ukraine, the international community has decided, well, we want it to be properly funded, we want it to be properly staffed, and they're giving it lots of money and lots of staff. So the question that we at some point have to wrestle with is that impacting the independence? Who's deciding the priority of the cases that it has? Is it the funders, or is it the independent prosecutor and the judges? Okay. So, and then as Roy said, last month, there were indictments or arrest warrants against Putin and Belova for unlawful deportation or transfer of children in Ukrainian occupied territory. Okay. You will note that Article 2B8 not only criminalizes the deportation of civilians from occupied territory, but also criminalizes the transfer of the occupier's population into the territory it occupies. Now, let me spend a few minutes now on the U.S.'s relationship with the ICC. It's kind of a love-hate relationship that has resulted in many inconsistent approaches. Well, probably love-hate is not the right word. It's kind of like a like-hate. I'm not sure anyone loves it, but it's a lot like it and many hate it. So let me just talk about, and an awful lot has happened in this relationship in the last 2 months. So from its very inception, under the Clinton administration, the U.S. signed the treaty. near the end of the Clinton administration. Then the Bush administration unsigned it. First time it's happened in international treaties. Obama tried to support its work when it was consistent with U.S. interests. The Trump administration, John Bolton, made it his personal mission to delegitimize the court. Now, the Biden administration has taken very concrete steps to support the ICC's work. Now, one of the things that happened right after the Rome Statute, the treaty that created the ICC, was the U.S. insisted on what we call Article 98 agreements. So countries that were receiving substantial aid from the U.S., it then became conditioned on them signing a non-surrender agreement, so that if the ICC issued an arrest warrant for U.S. personnel that were located in their country, they were agreeing that they would not arrest them. So you have a series of these. This is one, a typical one is from Azerbaijan. I forget how many we have altogether, but there are a good few of those. The key law that defined the relationship between the ICC and the U.S. is the APSA, the Armed Personnel Service Agreement. Sorry, Armed Service Members Protection Act, okay? And we call it APSA, that's how we call it. It's informally known as the Hague Invasion Act. Now, I was living in The Hague at the time this was passed, and I had 2 small children at the time, and I must say I kind of pondered how curious it would be if we were the subject of U.S. forces invading where we lived as Americans. That never happened. But has a number of provisions, but most significant for our purposes, the enforcement of Article 98, it requires the enforcement of Article 98 non-surrender agreements. It prohibited U.S. participation in peacekeeping missions in state party countries and prohibited assistance of any kind to the ICC. That included financial support, investigative support, intelligence sharing. When the ICTY began its work, it was assisted greatly by U.S. support. In fact, DOJ sent about 40 prosecutors, senior prosecutors, who worked at the ICTY for about 4 years to help it get off the ground and build its early cases. One of the features of APSA was the Dodd Amendment that was proposed by Senator Chris Dodd. It was a carve-out for certain cases, and you can see it there. I think his interest in it may have been due to his father, Thomas Dodd, who was a close advisor of Justice Robert Jackson at Nuremberg. So he really valued the importance of international justice. And so we have this carve-out for particular perpetrators. Now, in the event that anyone found a way around APSA and provided some indirect support, there was also this provision in the Foreign Relations Authorization Act for fiscal years 2000 and 2002. And it, as you can read there, prohibits any money being used to support any activity of the ICC. So now at this point, the tide is all the way out in terms of the relationship of the U.S. and the ICC and whether or not it's going to provide any support. There were some anomalies, most notably in 2005, during the administration of George W. Bush, where there was a vote in the Security Council to refer the situation in Sudan to the ICC for investigation. Everyone expected that the U.S. would use its veto power, but it didn't. It didn't vote for it, but it abstained and allowed that vote then to refer the genocide going on in Sudan to the ICC. Okay, so now the tide has come back in really quite recently. So at the end of last year, but it's really happening now, and we'll talk about what's happened in the previous few weeks, it's the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023. It's a bill of over 1,000 pages and covers all different types of things. The ones that are relevant for our discussion here tonight are Section 7073, and the bill replaces the language of the Dodd Amendment and creates another carve-out, a carve-out for crimes being committed in Ukraine, okay? There's also laws passed this year. This is the National Defense Authorization Act of 2023, and there are 2 sections there. Okay? In section 5945, there's a policy statement of what is the U.S. policy now with respect to the ICC. And you can see it there. It's the policy of the U.S. to collect, analyze, and preserve evidence and information related to war crimes and other atrocities committed during the Russian invasion of Ukraine for use in international courts, not just the ICC, but any international court. So as a statement of official policy, all federal investigative and intelligence institutions can cooperate with international prosecutions. The next section, so in section 6512, it actually creates the position of a coordinator with the authority to oversee the implementation of that policy. The coordinator is charged with proactively identifying and preserving information and evidence relevant to international prosecutions. Okay, so now the tide has come all the way in. And we hear Ambassador Beth Van Schack, the ambassador at large for global justice, she sets this out in a recent speech she gave about the 4 things that have now changed. First, this recent legislation makes clear there is no prohibition of assisting the ICC with respect to Ukraine. Second, there are no funding prohibitions. Third, ICC investigators can come to the U.S. to interview witnesses related to Ukraine. And fourth, if war criminals are discovered on U.S. soil, they can be prosecuted here. This is a reference to the Justice for War Crimes Act, which I will discuss in a moment. So the passage of these bills with overwhelming bipartisan support seems to herald a new era where the U.S. will actively support the work of the ICC with respect to Ukraine. And who knows, now that that door is open, perhaps in the future that support may expand to investigations unrelated to Ukraine. But wait. On March 8th, the New York Times reported that the Department of Defense was opposing the cooperation enabled by the legislation. In addition to routine concerns about revealing sources and methods of sensitive intelligence sources, the Times reported that, quote, American military leaders oppose helping the court investigate Russians because they fear setting a precedent that might help pave the way for it to prosecute Americans, unquote. So here, the fears that prompted the passage of APSA in 2002 have resurfaced and have caused tension between the White House's desire to proactively assist investigations related to Ukraine and the Pentagon's fear that doing so will expose U.S. military personnel to the jurisdiction of the ICC. This was then followed by another show of bipartisan cooperation when 6 senators, Durbin, Graham, Menendez, Tillis, Blumenthal, and Whitehouse, sent a joint letter to President Biden urging him to be steadfast in providing the ICC with investigative support related to Ukraine. And that is where we stand now. Okay, so it has not been resolved. We'll see in the coming weeks what happens. But even when that's solved, there's another core issue which we have to address with the U.S. support or the effectiveness of the International Criminal Court. And that's the issue of complementarity. Its jurisdiction is what is known as complementarity jurisdiction. Okay, and it is in the preamble. Here it is in Article 1. And it shall be complementary to national criminal jurisdictions. That means that it only has jurisdiction, it only is competent to deal with these cases if there's nothing being done at the national level, okay? And it's a 2-step test. Is there currently an ongoing investigation or prosecution of the matter that the ICC is seeking jurisdiction of? Well, the Prosecutor General's office has lots of cases going on. If there is a current case, is the state conducting a genuine investigation or prosecution? Well, we're trying to help them to do that. So the cases that they will probably only have jurisdiction of are the most senior cases. Cases against Putin, some of the senior military leaders, which for different reasons, for issues of sovereign immunity or for other reasons, they won't be able to prosecute. So it's a very limited number of cases that ultimately that the ICC will have jurisdiction over. What about setting up an ad hoc tribunal? The ICTY, where I worked, was a tribunal set up just for Yugoslavia. We have Rwandan tribunals. Let me just make one more point. The ICTY tribunal where I worked at had concurrent jurisdiction. That means we were working, other courts in Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia could work, other courts in Germany took a few cases, so we all could be pitching in. The ICC is a very different jurisdictional requirement, okay? So that's, the ad hoc tribunals are established by a Security Council resolution under the authority of Chapter 7, okay? Maybe I'll just point out that there's no mention of a court in Article 41, but that's the legal basis for establishing courts under Chapter 7. Well, that's not going to happen with Russia and probably China with veto power. So that's not going to help close the impunity gap. Okay. What about the aggression tribunal? So it took the U.S. a long time to formulate its position, but a couple of weeks ago, it came out in support of a Ukraine court with international elements dedicated to the crime of aggression. Well, definitionally, the crime of aggression can only be committed by senior leaders, the kind of people that would be prosecuted by the ICC, which does not have jurisdiction over aggression. So it will not do much to close the impunity gap. Still leaves 90-something thousand cases now, still leaves a gigantic impunity gap. So, and that's what tonight now I want to submit to you. The surest way to close that impunity gap is universal jurisdiction. What is universal jurisdiction? I'll give you a moment to read that. What if every court in the world, every prosecutor in the world, had the legal authority to investigate and prosecute these crimes? What if we could set up systems to organize cooperation and collaboration between countries? What if the cases could be brought in the countries where the victims now live as refugees? We could close the impunity gap. So I want to spend the rest of my remarks here talking to you about what are the legal issues, what's the legal basis, how could we do it, and why we must do it. Okay, and the first most notable case of universal jurisdiction is the Eichmann trial. And you can see here the Supreme Court of Israel in trying him said the state of Israel was therefore entitled, pursuant to the principle of universal jurisdiction, and in the capacity of a guardian of international law and an agent for its enforcement, to try the appellant. So Israel as a state didn't even exist when the crimes were being committed. But this principle of universal jurisdiction is so broad and so powerful, and it's not disputed now. History doesn't dispute that Eichmann's trial was a valid legal proceeding. Okay? Where does it come from? Comes from the grave breaches section of the Geneva Conventions. Okay? So perhaps the most widely adopted convention or treaty in the world. Article 49, countries that have signed it, commit to enact whatever legislation is necessary to incorporate war crimes into their domestic legislation. It also obliges all signatories to the Geneva Conventions to bring such persons before their own courts. In this passage, states not only committed themselves to prosecuting violators of the Geneva Conventions before their own courts, irrespective of where those crimes occurred, but they also agreed that under law, their citizens could be prosecuted before the courts of other signatory nations upon allegations of grave breaches of the conventions. And then Article 50 sets out what those crimes are. And as you can imagine, murder, torture, inhumane treatment, rape are all subject to universal jurisdiction. This was incorporated into Section 2441 of Title 18 of the U.S. Code, but the way in which it was done left our enabling legislation a bit out of sync with the Geneva Convention. This has been corrected. So also a very busy 3 months in international law for the United States. On January 5th, the Justice for War Crimes Act became law. This was the fourth development Ambassador Van Schaik referred to, and it brings U.S. law into better alignment with the Geneva Conventions and allows prosecutions under universal jurisdiction subject to the approval of the Attorney General. Here is a picture of the Soviet delegation signing the Geneva Conventions, giving other countries the right to prosecute and investigate Russian violators of the Geneva Conventions. And through the international law of succession, this signature still applies today for the Russian Federation. So that's the Geneva Conventions. We can find similar provisions in the Convention Against Torture. And you remember Alex Druke and Andy Hu, two Americans that were tortured when they were captured. Russia ratified this on March 3rd, 1987. Similarly, the Genocide Convention has similar provisions. And U.S. Code 18, Title 18, Section 1091, it limits the jurisdiction somewhat, but there is still a broad basis to prosecute the crime in the U.S. Now, one of the things I've heard is that, well, Putin's in the Kremlin, he's still a sitting president, we're not ever going to get him. And I remind people that when we first indicted Slobodan Milosevic, he was the sitting president of Serbia. It took a couple of years, but eventually, when his support fractured, the indictment, the arrest warrant, was the vehicle in which he was removed from the country and then sent to The Hague. There's one other problem, which I could spend a lot of time discussing, but I won't. There's also this issue of sovereign immunity. So even though universal jurisdiction allows us to prosecute these cases everywhere, there is this concept of sovereign immunity that, and you can see here in Article 27 of the ICC statute, it's done away with it. But the heads of state still have immunity when they travel around the world. They cannot be arrested. Now, there's been some movement, and you can see South Africa has taken the lead on this. In 2002, it has removed sovereign immunity for any case related to the ICC, okay? So that's the legal basis. So how do we do it? I'm sorry, this is just an article by Theodore Morone. He was a Holocaust survivor. He was a military lawyer for Israel. He's worked for the State Department, a law professor at NYU, and one of the most respected jurists in international law. And here in a recent article, he says, this is the way of the future. This is how we close these impunity gaps, okay? So there are practical problems with universal jurisdiction, language, it's far away, how do we do it all? But I think it doesn't take care of all of the work of a prosecutor, but it really is quite a head start. Now, as a prosecutor, someone who's investigated these cases, I always face two really big problems. One is investigative problems. One is connecting the crime to the person who committed the crime. Now, you can just imagine if Wagner stormed in here right now, we would be fleeing, we would be concerned about our safety, the safety of our loved ones. We are not looking to make identifications or to get reliable evidence that we can report to an international court. And that's one of the toughest things that we've had to do. I'm going to show you a piece of evidence from the Milosevic case that will give you some sense of the kind of evidence that we look for to help us. So this is the Scorpion unit, had no idea who its members were. So this video, it's a 2-hour video, identifies everyone, lots of information that helped us. It ends in the murder of some of the men from Srebrenica. I'm not going to show that tonight. I never show it just out of respect for the victims, but you will see them. So I don't want anyone to think that you're going to see, yes, an awful scene. And as you can see, very easy to identify. So we know who they are. In fact, this man here, he testified as a public witness.
Hajde da zapite me. Hajde ovamo, sedite u stranu. Tamo, da. Sjedi tamo, snagaj se tamo. Tamo, bravo, i sjedi tamo. Brzo! Ovako, klanjaj pijeska ovako.
Brže! Brže!
The boy in the green sweatshirt is the youngest. He's 16.
Opa! Tamo!
Kad si Srbe ubio, nisi čekao pitka pirata.
Bez dole! Tako.
Zeka!
This man's begging for water. They mock the boys that they'll die virgins, and then they take them up and they shoot them. All of these men are in jail now. We were able to identify them. They've been prosecuted and they're in jail. That video took us like 5 years to find. I got it from a lawyer. The original, I went down with my investigator. It's a long story, but it took us 5 years to find that video. Google and you'll find thousands on the internet now. It's a very different thing. In fact, the problem now is that there's so many videos, it's really hard to figure out what they are and are they authentic. But there's a lot of interesting things going on. There are now people are working with artificial intelligence to scan all of these videos and find, oh, that's the name of a street, and that street shows up in this video, in this photo, and aggregate them. We hope in the next few months you'll be able to say, I want to see video that happened at that location on this day, and everything that's up in the cloud will be there. Okay, I've been working with this large organization for several months now that is putting all of this into a major database, and I've helped them develop a database that will facilitate the work of investigators to find what the evidence that they need. Okay. Bell and Cat is one of the organizations that's working on this, and they're doing remarkable work at helping identify and make sense of this large amount of evidence. There's one case that I was helping on. They were able to take the serial number off a tank, or a number that appeared in the tank, trace it back through public train manifests and different public records, and trace it all the way back to where it left, the camp where it left in Russia. So it's really stuff that can be done now with a few, an hour on the internet would take me months and months sending out investigators. So it's really changed. And I think this is part of the reason why the moment for universal jurisdiction is now. We now have these other tools at our disposal that can really assist us. We can identify, these are some of the direct perpetrators. They put up their passport numbers, their addresses. I mean, all of this would have been so hard for us to do in the past. So that's the first problem, identifying the direct perpetrators. The second problem is, well, how do you connect it to the senior leaders, Putin and the senior military leaders? I'm going to show you another short clip from another 2-hour video that was provided, and I think you'll recognize Milosevic. And this is Stanisic.
Veterani jedinice za specijalne operacije Državne bezbjednosti Republike Srbije, postrojeni za smotru, raportira pukovnik Žika Ivanović. Gospodine predsjedniče, dozvolite mi vam predstavim cijele veterane jedinice. Gospodine predsjedniče, pukovnik Božović Radorica. Bravo, čito se ovdje svoje.
The reason I showed that, now Milosevic died before the judgment, I think that conversation would have featured very prominently in his judgment. He had his own version of Wagner. He called them the Red Berets. And after the Bosnian War was over, he had these people committing genocide now returning to Serbia. What was he going to do with them? He created a special police unit, built them a beautiful building, and this is the dedication of that building. He's now being introduced to them. The person who introduced him and saluted, he was involved in the assassination of the prime minister, Zoran Zingic. But he goes up to that first guy and he announces him as Bolshevik. And he's never met him before, but he says that conversation goes something like this. Oh, Bozovich, I recognize the name from all of the reports that I read about your things. Bozovich, we could connect to crimes. We could connect him ordering crimes. So that's the kind of thing that we need. But, you know, when you look at the situation in Ukraine, I mean, yeah, this is just yesterday. I went up to the Kremlin website. Everything Putin says is published. It's translated into English. Now, I'm sure there's a bit of a spin on some of it, but when I look through it, when he's saying things like everything in the Ukraine is going according to our plan, as a prosecutor, I'm thinking that's pretty good stuff, you know? And so there's a lot of stuff that's out there as well for that top link that I think is very valuable as well. And just to show you, I mean, that's a statement that was very important in the Mladic case. And this is the kind of stuff that, that is now more readily available. And there's one of the statements that we have from the Ukraine situation. Okay, so just want to end this about how this is a mass grave that we discovered during the Mladic case, more than 20 years after it was there, but we were able to get great evidence from it. They are now processing mass graves very shortly after they're created. So I expect there'll be lots of really good evidence. So that's the how. Now the why. Why should we do this? Now, I think the best way, most of you probably have never sat in an international criminal court and listened to a victim. I'm going to play about 4 minutes of the first witness in the Mladic case. And I think you'll have a sense of why it's so important for us to do this. This person's name is Elvin Passage. He lives in St. Louis now. He's administrator of a hospital supply office there. The prosecutor is Camille Bible. She's a federal judge in Flagstaff, Arizona now.
Could you describe for us in the time period before the conflict in Bosnia what it was like for you as a child to go to school surrounded by others from differing ethnicities?
Yes, going to school to Verbanci, I actually had a great time with my friends, Serbs and Croats at the same time. Before the war, we shared the same classroom. We were playing basketball, soccer, and all activities. We were there was no any animosity whatsoever. We were celebrating holidays together, whether you were a Muslim, Croat, or a Serb. I just remember my second day being there that I noticed my dad had a conversation with my mom to take me away with him instead of going and with mom. I approached my mom and he hugged my mom and kissed her and told her that if I ever done anything to you in the past or during our marriage time, if I did any harm to you, I want you to forgive me. Because this is a long path, long way to go. We don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of people traveling. I want you to forgive me in any way. And I remember my mom kind of pushed me. She said, "Don't say that." It was so hard.
Please take your time, Mr. Passage, and indicate to Ms. Bibles if you're ready to continue.
Yeah, my mom told him, "Don't say that. You are gonna survive. Don't say that." I remember I held my father's hand, and that's when we left. It was approximately 8 p.m. that night. And the bullets were flying everywhere. And I remember my dad says, go, and he grabbed me and I was running down. We were on this hill. And Dad was constantly behind me, just trying to shield me. After that, there were people who passed us. And close to this river, there were mines. And They landed on the mines, including the Basim, and they were injured. Approximately 10 people died from the mines, and I was still stuck on this, and finally I got this coat off me, and we didn't know at first that it was the minefield. We stopped there a moment, and somebody yelled, "It's the mines, we're okay, we can cross the river." And when we were walking by, when I walked by, I saw Basim, his lines blown away. And he was crying and yelling, "Give me something, kill me," or something. And we were just, my dad grabbed me and says, "Don't look." And we were trying to jump over this river. To me, it looked big, I don't know, but we had to jump over it to go on the other side. They were calling, and I remember Basim was saying, "Give me something, kill me." And I think they left him something later. When we were on the other side, we heard the gunshot. I think he killed himself.
About 2 minutes.
He says, "Get up." I said, uncle insisted. He says, "Get up. You will survive." That's when I stood up. And I was the last boy who got up from the group. As I was walking, we were instructed not to look around, just to look in front of you. Don't make any sound, just follow the group. And as we started, I turned around. I remember, I'll never forget that. I looked up, and on my right, on the second floor, I seen a hand. There was a hand. Wait, I didn't see the body, but there was a hand waved like this. And I see that hand in my dreams.
When your house has been destroyed, family members brutally tortured and killed, the women and girls in your family and community raped, when everything you worked for and valued has been destroyed, the only things you have left are a burning desire for the truth to be known and the hope that there might be justice, however improbable it might and difficult it might be to achieve, that there may be justice. Until the day when we figure out how to prevent atrocity crimes from occurring, we must ensure that the victims of those crimes have a voice. That's the first reason. The second reason was told to us by Justice Jackson in the second sentence of his opening in Nuremberg, the place where this experiment in international justice started. Justice Jackson said that civilization cannot tolerate such grave crimes being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. He correctly characterized atrocity crimes, wherever they occur, as an existential threat to human existence. And as we see more and more atrocities being committed, not only in Ukraine, but places like Syria and Myanmar, we must reaffirm our resolve to support international justice and to bring to bear every tool and mechanism we have at hand. It is my firm hope that in the years ahead, the promise and potential of universal jurisdiction will be realized in countries around the world, and country by country, the gaps of impunity will be closed. Thank you for your attention this evening.
Maybe I can just ask a quick question in the process, which is the International Criminal Court is probably not even known to most people here because it's not in the news in general. It's been criticized a fair bit in its early years. What was the criticism, and have they overcome it?
No, they have not overcome the criticism. It's cost an awful lot of money. They've done very few cases. It's a large bureaucracy that has proven to be largely ineffective. Now, having said that, one of the reasons why the ad hoc tribunals were so successful is because of U.S. support. We have the know-how, we have the expertise. We were able to shape those courts into effective, efficient courts. We've been absent at the table for the ICC for different reasons that I won't debate here, but I think that's largely one of the reasons why the ICC is not the effective institution that we need.
We have a lot of foes around the world. Will the universal jurisdiction place the U.S. at risk?
Could a court, let's say in another country, bring a case against a U.S. citizen?
Yes.
We've signed the Geneva Conventions as well. They already have that authority under the Geneva Conventions. Yeah, and you're speaking to the fear that it's a legitimate fear that we have as the U.S. that, you know, what prosecutor wouldn't want to go down in history as the person to indict a U.S. president and that kind of thing. But I don't think our reaction to that should be just to walk away from international justice. We've been at the leading edge of this. It's so important. I think we can address and manage those threats and vulnerabilities.
My question has to do with the Orthodox Church's support, if you will. In Serbia, we saw whatever he was, a bishop or a priest or whatever, blessing war criminals. We have in Russia today the primate of the Russian Orthodox Church blessing what's going on within Ukraine. So, and I know the Orthodox Church is disaggregated, you know, but it leaves me just sick to think of the Orthodox Church and its various disaggregated, forms, blessing these war crimes. Any comments?
Yes, well, as morally reprehensible as that might be, it's not an international crime. Having said that, in my investigation in the Milosevic case and Mladic case, there was evidence that some of the Orthodox churches were stockpiling weapons and were participating in more concrete ways. We have to make decisions about who we prosecute. There was a long time there that I thought, when I was doing my cases, I tried to reflect all of the groups of people that were committing these crimes, and they were on my radar. But ultimately, my boss thought, and I kind of agreed, that there were, other people more deserving of our attention in our cases. But yeah, it is quite troubling. And just also to be fair, I'm Catholic, but there was allegations against the Catholic Church of supporting some of the Croats as well, and the Muslims in Bosnia. There was also allegations there as well. So I don't think any religion can hold their hand up and say that we have not in some way tainted ourselves by being involved in some of these wars.
And since I am from Kosovo and I lived in Croatia too before I moved here, but always criticism about ICTY was they try to balance crime about the war side. Now, I don't want to ask about that, but you are familiar with the name Carla Del Ponte, who in 2008 published book accusing Kosovo Liberation Army for organ trafficking. Based on that, European Council established investigation, again through the Dick Marty who had the report. Now, all this organ trafficking was baseless. Now, the special court, which is Kosovo court in The Hague, but all these charges about organ trafficking are dropped, but these people are kept there for something else now. How do you explain that?
So the trial, the court that you're referring to, this Kosovo Specialist Court, they actually began the prosecution of two former presidents, Hasim Thaci and another man. It began last week, Monday. So the work of the court began with the Marty report, but there were broad investigations done. Apparently they have like 350 witnesses. So the fact that it started, my Milosevic case started with his article, the Kosovo case, but it got much broader. So I guess that's my explanation for that. It's not because they needed to find something and all of the evidence we put to the test.
This one has to do more so with from the U.S. standpoint, thinking about with what we want to involve ourselves in outside of the U.S. and what we want to give other countries access to involve themselves in with us. I know from an East African standpoint, growing up in Kenya and then moving here later, obviously I'm still in my 20s, but recently, the question in sub-Saharan Africa has been consistent throughout my whole childhood, even now in my adulthood. When I go back, I hear it all the time of why them and not us, right? So when I ask why them and not us, when it comes to these cases that are being gaining international interest, right? Rarely is it, okay, these situations are going on in sub-Saharan Africa that have that are about similar topics, that are about similar kinds of ways that these crimes are happening, durations of time that they're happening for, and a lot of them gain international support, especially with the U.S. and Europe. So there's a kind of sense of why them and not us, especially.
You mean why Ukraine, but not countries in sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, why not just Ukraine, right? Because why the like either European or in sometimes that like Europe to Asia, West Asia. Why them and not us when it comes to international support, but also when it comes to international fear, right? Of people being worried about, that side of the world, but also willing to help that side of the world and team together. There's the age-old, U.S. versus U.K., but they are willing to team together, U.S. and France. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. And just to flesh out the picture about Africa, so many countries in Africa, or several countries, actually self-referred cases for the ICC.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was criticism that you were focusing just on African countries. So it's been a difficult relationship, and there several of the countries threatened to pull out of the treaty. But you touch on a point that I touched on earlier, is the ICC should be completely independent, and it should investigate cases as it comes to it. It should not be insulated from international political pressures. And what Ukraine shows us, if they're going to be chronically underfunded so that they can't do the kinds of investigations that you believe they should be doing in Africa, and part of that is because they just don't have the resources. But then when Ukraine comes along and they say, well, we'll send staff, we'll send money, we'll send you equipment, we'll give you everything you need, we just want results in Ukraine. That's kind of a politicalization of the court, which I think we need to be very concerned about. Ideally, every terrible crime, every atrocity would get the same level of focus and resources. But it seems, at least now at this juncture, that's not true.
Thank you.
You've talked a lot about the process to get to where we are and the support and the lack of support sometimes from the United States. The first question is, as we look around the world, are the opponents or the people who are less hesitant to support the ICC emboldened by the lack of their perceived lack of support or lack of unified support for the United States? And if so, the second part of the question is, what can we do to help turn that around to provide more support from our level to the ICC and the work they're doing?
So as I understand your question, are potential perpetrators being emboldened by the difficult relationship?
More of the other countries that would say in response to the ICC, can't be that important that the ACC doesn't have control over us because the United States doesn't support it. Why should my country support prosecution against for any crimes we may have been accused of?
When you say we
being the foreign country.
The foreign country. Yeah, we have different responses to it as countries. But other countries, we've been kind of left on the sidelines, and countries have moved forward. So you're all familiar with the Senate 2014 torture report that made findings about CIA personnel committing torture in Afghanistan. For a long time, there was this very tense back and forth between the U.S. and the prosecutor, and all she was asking was, are you going to address this? Are you going to? Because once the U.S. addresses it, she has no jurisdiction. Complementarity cuts her off. And it was a very difficult political situation. The UK approach was that they took someone from my office, Andrew Cayley, a very respected prosecutor, and said, we want you to look in this and look into these allegations against our personnel, and then we'll deal with it in our country. Okay. And that's all we would have to do to insulate it doesn't mean that they have to be convicted. It just means we have to have a genuine investigation and process to investigate claims like were found in the 2014 torture report.
Well, one of the questions I had asked specifically about Secretary Austin's comments being negative after following all the positive things we'd heard during your presentation. Does Secretary Austin's comments about reciprocity negatively impact the ICC's work?
I mean, they're important concerns, and they do have an impact. I guess, and I've dealt with a lot of different countries in my investigations and queries that I had. And each situation, there are special concerns. And I was fortunate in many cases. I had people that were thoughtful. They believed in the goal of international justice. And we looked at it as a problem. So what are your concerns? Is there a way we can sort out, we can protect those concerns that you have? And in just about every case, I was able to fashion an agreement or an understanding that allowed that evidence, important evidence, to be used in court, but still protect the concern that was expressed.
Good. Thank you.
So I have one last question, which is about the crime of aggression, which you say, which has not been addressed in a court. Why has there been no court to deal with the crime of aggression until now? And is one being set up? And do you trust that they can do their job in an apolitical way?
Yeah, and the political implications are obviously a big part of it. So let me first say that I can't imagine a more clear-cut case of the crime of aggression than what we've seen with the Russian invasion, okay? Having said that, there's been a lot of dispute over the years about what exactly is the crime of aggression, and now we've defaulted to the UN Charter. But I think there's going to be a focus there on its definition in customary international law, and without going into the weeds on that, it's not a sure thing. Okay, and also it's only going to be for very few people. And although people are saying, oh, we can do this really cheap, there is no cheap international justice. And so myself and some others are concerned, is it going to suck the resources? I mean, because we all, as well-resourced as the U.S. is, there's a limit. Is it going to suck all this money and resource away from universal jurisdiction or the work of the ICC to focus in on what they call the mother of all crimes of the crime? And to me, I have a more pragmatic approach. I would be happy if we get Putin behind bars for crimes against humanity. In Nuremberg, that was the most serious, the crime of aggression, but the crimes against humanity, it's a very serious crime. And in a pragmatic thinking, I'd be happy with that. All that money that would go into the aggression, let's use it to get more perpetrators, bring them before courts.
Well, I think on that note, we will end it tonight. But I really thank you deeply for presenting, for laying out the history, the development. You have been a unique witness of and participant. And I think that what you're saying now about where it goes from here is extremely valuable. Thank you very much, Dermot.
Thank you for inviting me again.